Good afternoon. I'm Judy Woodward, the History Coordinator of the Ramsey County Library, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this Tuesday Scholar event. Our speaker today is Laurie Sturdevant, whose topic is A Look at the Minnesota Legislature 2023. Laurie Sturdevant is a retired Star Tribune editorial writer, author, and columnist who has written about Minnesota government and politics since 1975. Today's program is brought to you through the co-sponsorship of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute of the University of Minnesota with the financial support of Minnesota's Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. And we are very grateful to these organizations. Thank you very much. And now I'd like to turn things over to our speaker, Laurie Sturdevant, on A Look at the Minnesota Legislature 2023. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Judy. It's fun to be back with you. I feel a little humbled and uncertain about being called a scholar, given the title of your program, Tuesday with a Scholar. But I'm certainly a veteran of what's gone on at the Minnesota Capitol over many, many years and watched this session with a great deal of interest. I'm going to get ready to share my screen with you and share some slides that I prepared for today. So hang on here as I make that happen. It was a remarkable year. Not since 1973 have we seen a session with this much activity going on all at once. And of course, there's a parallel there from that session of 50 years ago, and that is who was in charge and what was the prelude to that political alignment. 1973 was the first year in state history in which there was a DFL trifecta, this idea we've been hearing about the House, the Senate, and the governor's office all in one party's hands. We had lots of years of Republican trifectas before that, but the first DFL trifecta in state history was in 1973. A lot happened that year. There was this pent-up demand for all kinds of legislation about open meetings and about the way workers' comp and unemployment comp worked, and it was the second session of the Minnesota Miracle, the way that we had altered the relationship between state and local governments. That all was big in 1973. But we've had some other DFL trifectas since then. 3 times in the 1980s, 3 sessions would have qualified for that. We had the most recent one just 10 years ago when Mark Dayton was governor in 2013 and 2014. So I went back and looked at the numbers to see how this session really stacked up. And in terms of numbers of bills introduced, yes, this was a record beater. But there were plenty of sessions in those earlier years that enacted more bills. And that has to do with a topic maybe for a larger conversation another day. There's something in the Constitution called a single subject rule, which says that bills ought to embrace just one subject. And we have been routinely violating that rule for the last 25 years or so. The courts, one of these days, could decide to scold the legislature sufficiently that they need to change their ways. But so far, the courts have let the legislature be on that topic, mostly anyway. So we now have fewer bills doing more all the time, it seems like, than we used to. But this year indeed was special. It was different with all of that was accomplished in a big sweeping way by satisfying the DFL agenda that had been part of campaigns for years, at least 20 years. What made this year different, I think there was a real sense on the part of the Democrats in leadership that there was so much that had been left undone. Decisions that were made 20 years ago, in the first years of Governor Palente's administration, when the state was in money trouble, we squeezed some things that have never really recovered. There was a sense that we were just needed to catch up in so many areas with regard to government spending and government activity. And for once, there was ample money to do that. As you know, we've never seen as big a state surplus as these legislators had. They had roughly $17.5 billion to spend in the next 2 years above and beyond base spending. Now, about 2/3 of that was one-time money, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. There was also more internal cohesion in DFL ranks than we used to see. We used to see within both parties quite a rural-urban split. That has changed in recent years. We now have a rural-dominated GOP and an urban-dominated DFL. There's just a good deal more willingness of DFLers and Republicans to stick together. Not only did we have more cohesion in DFL ranks, but we had relatively few Republican legislators this session cross over and vote for even bills that were pretty popular bills, pretty good bills. There's a story in today's, I think, MinPost about Jim Abler, the state senator from Anoka, who distinguished himself as being the only Republican state senator who voted frequently with the DFL on any bills at all. And I know there was a very concerted effort in the Minnesota House to keep the minority ranks together in opposition, even on bills that they otherwise might have supported, such as early education funding increases. Well, and another thing that made this year different, and I always noticed the gender split in the legislature, we had a lot more women in this session, and we've had all female leaders, both at the very top. We had Speaker Melissa Hortman from Brooklyn Park, and we had Carrie Dietzick, the state senator from Northeast Minneapolis, as the Senate's majority leader. Lots of women in leadership position in key committees as well. Both chairs of the tax committee, for example, in both the House and the Senate were women. I think that makes a difference. They took seriously the campaign promises that they made and were less willing than I've seen in previous sessions to let some fights simmer for the sake of using them as campaign fundraising and rallying tools. This year, the idea was, we said we're going to do this. We have the means to do it. We have the votes to do it. Let's do it. That was a practical spirit that really infused this session. It got off to an early start. Look at the date on this headline, January 31st. The session had only been underway for about 3 weeks at that point, and a major abortion rights bill was enacted. The Democratic majority arrived with a strong sense that the abortion issue had worked in their favor in the 2022 election. And that desire to solidify abortion rights, what they basically here were doing was codifying into state statute what the courts had been saying in Minnesota since 1995. Which is that the state constitution does provide a right to reproductive liberty, reproductive freedom. So this was an early move and a strong signal that the Democrats were going to take on big issues and going to do so quickly this year. Then came lots of protections for around gender issues, health issues. The ban on conversion therapy was another early move. This was something, by the way, that we had been trying to do, that people had been trying to do at the Minnesota legislature since probably since the latter years of the Pawlenty administration, so 2009, 2010, to ban the effort to convert people out of a same-sex orientation. That we passed shield laws against any extradition or penalty from other states for those who come here seeking either abortion or gender-affirming care. I think that as we watched states around us, and I'm originally from South Dakota, so I always watch South Dakota a little more closely. We watched states around us passing all kinds of restrictions on gender-affirming care. The message of Minnesota's legislature and governor seemed to be, if you're not able to get the care you need, come to Minnesota. Here you'll be safe. Here you'll get the care you need and you'll be protected. I didn't expect a transportation bill to pass this year. In Governor Walz's first term, he at one point proposed a 20-cent increase in the state gas tax and got absolutely zero as a response from the legislature. Then a split legislature between Republicans and Democrats. And I thought, boy, after that experience, we're not going to see an effort to increase transportation funding. But I was wrong. By the end of this session, the gas tax was indexed to inflation, which means we will see a slow, but unless that is repealed, we'll see a steady increase in the gas tax in the next several years. It's predicted to go up by about a nickel over the next 4 years. These will be modest increases, and the way gas prices fluctuate, a lot of us won't notice it, but the highway trust funds certainly will notice it. It's been an area where we've been chronically underfunded for a long time. In addition, metro area folks will be paying an additional 3/4 cent on the sales tax for transit. This is another area where we have had chronic underfunding, transit systems running big deficits. Transit safety has been an issue as a result. Transit service has been dismaying. This is a chance for us to catch up and make transit really work for people again. That will also, I think, be a pro-workforce move. There's been a 50-cent fee on deliveries to your home of goods that are valued at more than $100, and it does not include food or prescription drugs. And that's of note. I spoke to a group shortly before the end of the session and talked to a woman who is in poor health and was concerned that her grocery deliveries that she depends on so much were going to cost her more. No, groceries are excluded, but deliveries of higher priced goods will get a 50-cent delivery fee, all going to the Highway Trust Fund again. There'll be some additional funding for transit safety, some matching funds for some federal money for passenger train service to Duluth and for building the Blue Line out to Brooklyn Park, and even rebates for electric bikes. I have a husband who loves to bike, and so this is going to be of interest to him. The State That Votes is the title of one of the books I've done. It was a book with Joan Grow called Turnout. We call it Turnout, Making Minnesota the State That Votes. She began to hear Minnesota described that way when she would go to national meetings in the 1990s. But other states had been getting ahead of us. I think the last time I spoke to this Ramsey County group, we talked about how other states were getting ahead of us in matters of voter protection and voting rights. Well, this session was catch-up time for us. Governor Pawlenty vetoed our first automatic voter registration bill in 2009. It finally passed in 2023 and was able to be signed into law. That simply says that instead of having to opt in when you go to a government service window, say a DMV window, and have to opt in to register to vote at the same time, you're automatically registered unless you opt out. It's an opt-out versus an opt-in. Something like 17 other states do this now. So our chance to be first, it was blown back in 2009, but we are doing it now. Voting rights were restored for felons, felons who are no longer in prison. This actually puts us in league with the great state of North Dakota, which was the first state that I knew of that had the simple rule that if you are in prison, you can't vote. But if you are out of prison on probation or for whatever reason, your voting rights are restored. It's simple. It's easy to understand. This has been the biggest single source of voting errors, the kind of things that some people want to call voter fraud in Minnesota. Allowing people who are no longer incarcerated to vote will take away that whole problem. And I think make it so that our numbers on voting fraud will go from few to almost none as a result of that. We also allow for pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds now. This is something that has been happening in other states. I believe this was also vetoed by Governor Pawlenty at one point. It allows students who are learning about voting and other civic obligations in their high school government classes, allows them to register to vote as part of that experience and get them ready to go to the polls without any question or doubt when they turn 18. One and done absentee ballot applications is something that those of us who voted absentee during the COVID years will maybe appreciate. In the previous administration, under previous state law, if you wanted to vote absentee, you had to make an application every year for every election in order to vote by absentee ballot. This says if you want to, you can make a one and done application, register to vote absentee. And of course, if you want to later change that status, you can, but it's considered a status that you have going forward unless you make that change. That's a nice change for people who are permanently disabled or otherwise in a permanent situation where they need to vote absentee. There are also new penalties for some voter interference and harassment of election judges, which is something that has been a problem in some states. And I'm always looking out for ranked choice voting. I've been in favor of ranked choice voting since I saw us elect a governor with 37% of the vote and decided that isn't adequate for a democracy like ours. Ranked choice voting would have changed that outcome, not maybe the different governor, but an outcome that would have given that governor a 50% plus one mandate. So since then, I've been interested in ranked choice voting. And there is now a study about how Minnesota would implement that on a statewide level. It's not been done yet, but it seems to be a step forward in that direction. Climate change, they didn't forget about climate change. They've early on the session passed a 100% carbon-free electricity generation requirement in Minnesota by 2040, which is aggressive, but not, according to the utilities, too aggressive. The utilities did not stand up and shout and oppose this bill. Some Republicans did, and it made me wonder if our Minnesota utilities don't think this is too onerous. Who were the Republicans advocating for there? Nevertheless, that was signed into law, along with a lot of incentives for the purchasing of electric vehicles and heat pumps and solar panels by all of us consumers, move to help schools and other institutions switch to solar panels and electric kind of vehicles, and some loans for green energy startups. This is a nice raft of things that states can do to help us with our energy transition that is now getting more and more urgent. Those of us who've experienced wildfire smoke in the last few days, I think, have a better understanding of what's at stake if we don't get a handle on our greenhouse gas emissions on this planet. We got a little bit of gun control. And that's another tough issue that I was not sure was going to pass, because we had a situation where the Democratic majority, particularly in the Senate, included some outstate Minnesotans from legislators from greater Minnesota who were not too keen on some gun control measures. But we got two ideas that have been around since before I retired. I wrote about them when I was an active editorial writer. That would be universal background checks for gun purchases, and then a red flag law, which is a permission for families or law enforcement to go to the courts and have guns removed from people who are in crisis of one sort or another and need to have, for their own safety as well as the safety of others, can make a case to a judge that it's time for that person's guns to be removed. There are those who think that these are rather minor tweaks on that don't do enough to address a major problem in our society. I know a number of people who would not who think that we ought to be moving more quickly to ban assault weapons in the state. In some states, Washington State, I know, has done this recently. That will be a conversation, I suspect, in the 2024 session and probably beyond. There were a whole lot of other public safety moves. And if you haven't heard about this yet, you will, because this is something that has a pretty strong partisan element. The Republicans began using this issue right after the session. In fact, the session may have still been on when they started using this issue in political campaign messaging, because it can be spun as being soft on crime. But it winds up being a shift in our public safety philosophy in favor of improving the chances that people, as they leave prison, can succeed in society, can find housing, can find employment, are ready to function, and thereby reducing recidivism. The focus, we have tended to think in our society of public safety as best purchased by long prison sentences, locking people up as the way to keep people safe. But in fact, the vast majority of people who are incarcerated are one day or another released, and making sure that they can succeed in society without going back to crime at that point may do as much, if not more, for the sake of public safety as long prison sentences do. So the bills that were passed include some shorter sentences for nonviolent offenders, an easier chance to get nonviolent records expunged, a lot more money for local policing. So there will be efforts for beefing up policing and allowing local governments to decide how to use that money most efficiently for themselves. But a lot more efforts in these bills to prepare felons for life after prison in the hope of reducing recidivism. We'll see how that works, and we'll see what kind of political hay gets made of that approach. It's been used in other states to some good effect. There are just an awful lot of efforts in this session to try to make life more affordable, especially for families raising children, families with middle and lower incomes raising children. The child tax credit is the thing that Governor Tim Walz is the proudest of. That's up to $1,700 per child. There's a sliding fee there based on income. But it's a real attempt to try to reduce childhood poverty in this state. And the claim is made, we'll see if it will bear out, that this will reduce the number of children growing up in families deemed to be in poverty, by about 25 to 30%. It's a big change, and it's a way to help put more resources in the hands of those people who are doing that important work of rearing children. There are also just general rebates of $260 per person, up to a maximum of $1,300 for a family of 4, that will go to all but the highest earners in this state. If you are lucky enough to be a high income person, you won't see that money, but pretty much everybody else will. It's not as big a rebate as Governor Tim Walz had requested, or that was talked about during the last campaign, and Republicans will be talking about that as well, that this was inadequate. But that's what the number that they came up with, in part so they could afford a bigger Social Security income exemption. If you are a Social Security recipient and a person with up to middle income, and I can't quite remember where the line is, but it's a good deal more of Social Security income is exempted from state taxation. It used to be about half of Social Security income in the state was, through a kind of a complicated formula, was exempted. It's now about 3/4 of that income won't be subject to state taxation. There's a paid family and medical leave program for workers, and it's something that is going to be mandatory on employers past a certain size. And that means that more people who have family emergencies while working can take a leave and stay employed. And that should actually be, I think, in the long run, a benefit for workers, though and a benefit for employers too. It's been certainly talked about. I think I first wrote about it in the 1980s as an idea that government could adopt. It's built on an employee-employer contribution program akin to a workers' comp or unemployment comp. And we'll see. It's right now, I think, not very popular with employers, but yet there were some employers who came to the Capitol in support of that idea. Likewise, there is now an earned sick and safe time requirement for some employers. I think it's much broader than was the case before. There's other ways that the legislature is trying to make life more affordable. There's been a tuition freeze at state colleges and universities for people come from families with incomes of under $80,000 a year. That's sounds really generous, but it's actually kind of a small change. Lots of those families had students that qualified for a variety of state aid programs, Pell Grants, and other things. Anyway, this simplifies things. It guarantees that if family income is under $80,000, you're going to be going to state colleges and state universities without a tuition charge. There's a big increase in early education scholarships for low and middle income families. I'm very high on this issue. We've been talking about increasing our early ed spending in the state for 20 years. It's a big catch up to finally get there. And I was talking to Art Rolnick just yesterday about this very topic, and he said that he's delighted with the change, but even with the big change that has just been enacted, only about half of the low-income kids between ages of birth and 5 will ultimately get these scholarships. We've made a big step forward, and we still have ways to go there. And then there's just a big surge in housing programs, including more rental assistance for low-income tenants. And I'll add to that list, there's a big increase in the property tax refund program. So one of the ways that we make housing more affordable is keeping property taxes down, and that's something the legislature has done as well. As you know, we have now a program underway that'll be coming soon, legal marijuana, something that people have been talking about for many years in this state. And we have free lunches at schools for all students, no matter what their income background is. These things are both controversial, and yet they I think, have a lot of enthusiasm in lots of places. So how should we judge this session's work? And that's the rundown of what all happened. My ideas about how I'm going to be judging this session are a bit forward-looking, and I've got two big ideas I'd like to lift up. One is this really a balanced budget? I've seen time and again in my long work at the Star Tribune, watching this legislature, that real trouble happens in the state when the state budget falls into deficit. we wind up cutting things that people rely on. We rely on state government a great deal in this state, much more so than in many other places. This is not trivial government. This is the real thing of how we live together and how we educate our kids, how we stay safe, and how we take care of our elderly. That happens all through state government in this state to a greater degree than in many places. So when we fall into deficit, all that gets to be at risk, since it's always easier politically to cut spending than it is to raise taxes. And those are the two tools, really. We have only those two tools for balancing the budget when it's out of whack. So is this budget balance in the tails? And by that, I mean in the years that follow the coming biennium, in fiscal years 26 and 27, not just 24 and 25. We don't really know for sure exactly how this turns out, but I'm going to be watching, and I hope others will too. When we see the new budget being analyzed very carefully by the Minnesota Management and Budget Office, that MMB website you see there, that link is the where to go to get this information. It will be out, I'm sure, in a matter of a few days or weeks, and we can look at what whether we've got a deficit coming in the out years. It wouldn't take much, I don't think, for a mild to moderate recession to cause trouble again, because a lot of money got spent this year. There was not much talk about let's set aside more money for a rainy day. And the old rainy day formula, we have a fully funded reserve based on the size of our old budget. Well, this budget is substantially bigger than the old budget, so the reserve needs to get bigger too, and that hasn't happened yet. So we'll see how that works. That's a concern I have. The other thing I always look at is, what did a legislature do about this state's biggest long-term problems? I subscribe to the idea that the legislature, the state government in this state, has a particular responsibility to the future, that a lot of what we do in state government is about making sure that we can prosper, not so much now as down the road. And we have big long-term problems that are not unique to Minnesota, but that may have a particular impact on Minnesota. I talked earlier about climate change, and that is certainly one of them. I would hold that's the biggest problem humanity faces right now anywhere. We did a lot this session about climate change, so I'll give them a good score there. I think that will bear continued watching. We have a worker shortage in the state. It's not a surprise. I started writing about forecasts of a worker shortage in the 20s and 30s, back in the aughts and the teens. It's something that we've seen coming because of what we knew would happen when the large baby boomer generation, and one of them, retired, left the workforce, and had to be replaced by a smaller cohort. And in Minnesota, a less well-prepared cohort. And that has to do with our educational achievement gap and who is in this next cohort that's coming. We have not a great record, as you probably know, in educating non-majority, non-white students in this state. And that's something that is going to become more and more critical for our future economic prosperity. So we need two kinds of measures to address the worker shortage. We need to attract workers, both from out of the state and keeping the workers that we have here. And then we have to better educate, better take advantage of the workers that we already have, make them more productive. They did some things along those lines. I wrote a column a few weeks ago that suggested that they could have done better by the University of Minnesota, which had a rather ordinary year at a time when I think that the University of Minnesota should have an extraordinary year. The University of Minnesota is still one of our great engines for economic growth and for the invention of the new kinds of industries that are good. It's good to set the table for our future prosperity. The silver tsunami is something that I use that phrase advisedly. What I mean to say is that we're going to have a lot more old people. And that's all of us baby boomers. And that's a problem that's coming in a particular way 10 and 20 years hence, when the active seniors that I'm one of now become the frail seniors who are in their 80s and 90s and need more care, a lot of which in the state is paid for by state government. Getting ready for that, making preparations for how we're going to pay for that and how we're going to provide that in a way that people find humane and satisfactory. That's work that needs more work from this session. It didn't get a lot of attention this session. I would say is ripe for some real effort in the next couple of years. And then racial injustice. And we can't have read the report that the federal government issued last week on Minneapolis policing. and not realize that we have a major issue in the state with racial inequality and the treatment of our non-white population. It's some of the criminal justice measures that were enacted this session ought to be of assistance. Some of the educational measures and the anti-child poverty measures that we enacted this session should make a difference. But there's clearly more work to be done to close the racial gap in the state and to make all of our citizens contribute to their fullest potential to help combat this worker shortage, which is going to be a drag on our economy unless we do something about that. Well, some years ago, and I quoted this in a column recently, some years ago, a state senator of long standing said, the purpose of state government is to set the table for the prosperity of the next generation. That line stuck in my head, and I'd like to just leave that line with you as you think about how you're going to judge this legislative session as political claims and counterclaims are made about it in the next few years. Did they do right by the future? That to me is the kind of the crucial test. I think it was a pretty good record. To use the Minnesota vernacular, not bad, could have been worse. It was pretty good, and yet there is certainly more to do. So thank you very much, Judy. I understand that there's an opportunity now for folks to ask questions, and you're going to moderate those, and I'm glad to have you do that. So let's proceed. I'll stop sharing my screen here.
Thank you very much. We do indeed have 25 questions already, but we have a lot of time left in this program. So I'm going to invite the audience, if you've been thinking of a question and you haven't typed it in yet, type it in now, because I think we're going to have plenty of time to get to a lot of these questions. So I will start right in. Okay, I think you did address this to some degree, but perhaps you'd like to amplify. The first questioner says, how will the new programs financed with the surplus be funded in the future? What happens when the surplus disappears?
Mm-hmm. That's a worry. I'm actually writing a column this week that I hope will be published this weekend in the Star Tribune about my admiration for what they've done in early education and my awareness that a good chunk of that is with one-time money. And there's that problem occurs throughout the budget. Various places, things that look like they could go on for a long time won't, because they're funded with one-time money. And that will leave a political question to the 2024 electorate and the 2025 legislature. How do we want to keep these things going at the level that they were funded with one-time money? And if we do, are we prepared for a tax increase to make that happen? Yeah, that's the hand that this legislature, I think, quite consciously dealt itself. The advocates I talked to yesterday for early education are, they're so optimistic. They're so happy with what they got. They're so sure that this is all going to stick because it's going to be so popular and it's going to produce such good results. And I've lived around that capital long enough to see it go the other way. There's not really a guarantee, and in a situation of deficit and crisis, things that we really value are also sometimes cut.
I'm going to skip down.
It's one of the things that I worry about this session.
I'm going to skip down to a question below, because I think it relates and more or less articulates the point of maybe some people. This person says, I am not pleased that the Democrats spent nearly the entire surplus, $19 billion, and grew the government by 40%. So do you think that is representative of, what the future might hold in terms of opposition?
Well, that's certainly what the rhetoric is that's being used. That's the argument that's being used. And it's said the argument is this is not being given back to the people. Well, some of that spending are tax credits that are being given back to the people. And some of that are programs that, if they work, and we have good evidence, like in the case of early childhood, that will save the public sector money in the long run. Art Rolnick said, if we had 20 years ago, when he first did his studies about the value of early education, if we had then did what he recommended and put a lot more money into early education, right now we would have a cohort of young adults who would be far less likely to be incarcerated, far more likely to be college educated and producing the tax revenue through their economic activities that would benefit us all. So it's hard to know how to categorize some of that spending, but it is a concern to me that we have not left much money on the bottom line. I'm interested to see what does the reserve fund look like and how ready is Minnesota for a possible recession, which seems like we might be due for another recession. So those are legitimate worries.
Sure. Here is a questioner who asks, we are a group through Compassion and Choices who hope to have a hearing on medical aid in dying. This did not happen. Could you talk a little bit about this, and what are the chances that we will get a hearing in a future legislative session?
Thank you for that question. And that is not an issue that I have followed. So I don't have any particular insight about what happened there. That issue has been around, though, for a while. We used to hear about folks calling for that kind of legislation, I think modeled after what the state of Oregon has done. I used to hear about that initiative. I don't know how much appetite there is on the part of the majority DFLers for that issue about assisted death issues. Compassionate Choices, I think, is the name that is often used. So I'm not much help on that issue. There is, on the part of the leadership, there's even when issues are reasonably popular with the rank and file members, the leadership has to make a political judgment about how much political peril they're going to put their people in before, and how much trouble might the next election bring. And those, as we now move into the 2024 session, that kind of calculus is going to become more and more important in seeing what comes to the fore and what doesn't. These legislative leaders are veterans, and they know very well there's only so much political peril that they dare put their people in.
Sure. Yeah. Do you happen to know, I mean, I believe they did pass legislation that allowed assistance in medical assistance in dying in I think it was Oregon.
Oregon has, I think, been the nation's leader in that regard.
And what has been the experience? Do you happen to know? It's
Again,
a little
this
bit
is not an issue I have covered, so I'm not well versed on it.
Sure. Okay. All right. Well, from that issue to trains, what are your thoughts about the allocated $194 million to build a train from Coon Rapids to Duluth? This is always a money loser, says this person. Is that true? Are they always
well, it sure was a money loser in the 80s when we used to call it Willard's Choo Choo, because Willard Munger, the legislator in Duluth, was always trying to keep that thing going. Amtrak to Duluth. Those of us who are, I have a little bit of interest in political history because, as you know, having written all these books. And the one notable thing I know that happened on that train to Duluth was at the Thanksgiving holiday season of 1981. When Kathleen Ritter, big Republican, who had her husband had some business in Duluth as well as owning the St. Paul Pioneer Press, and Marlene Johnson, who was the state's future lieutenant governor, but was then still just a DFL activist and businesswoman. These two met on the train, and they cooked up the idea that it became the Minnesota Women's Campaign Fund, which became today's Women Winning. So there you have a little bit of train history.
Great story.
The idea of better rail passenger rail service in the Midwest is going to be with us more and more as we think about what does it mean to use internal combustion engines less and less. Electric cars, and I have to tell you, we own 2 cars, and one of them is an electric vehicle. And we like to use the electric vehicle around town. It just works great. I'm still not real comfortable taking it on long trips because I don't have the notion that I would be without an ability to charge, or that the charging that would be available to me would be slow and would take a long time. That annoys me. And I suspect that will be true for lots of people who would say, gee, I wish I could take a fast train. Now, the fast train service that I'd like to see us revive would be to Chicago by way of Rochester.
Yes.
The need to get from the University of Minnesota campus, where we do a lot of medical research, to the Mayo Clinic, where we do a lot of medical research. Oh, that would be good for Minnesota. And I used to write about that. That idea is, I think, very promising. The train to Duluth is maybe nice certain times of the year. It wouldn't be my first choice. In this case, folks should know that the reason money was put forward is that it's a required match for some federal money that's already on the table. And that was true at a number of points in the budget, that in order to access some federal money, the state had to pony up some portion. And in this case, I think the state's portion is only 10 or 15%. So most of the money that's going to be used for that train is federal money. And it will, if we didn't grab it, it was going to go someplace else. So that's what was on offer, and that's what we got.
Yeah. Are trains more environmentally friendly than other forms of transportation?
And they can be electrified, you bet.
Oh, of course. Yeah, that makes sense.
It's the thing that my husband's an electrical engineer, and he's a great fan of the future hydrogen economy. We will probably use lithium-ion batteries for our cars for quite a while, but the bigger vehicles, the bigger transportation systems, and certainly our manufacturing sector are going to need more than batteries can provide. And for them, the use of hydrogen is probably what's coming, and trains that operate on hydrogen. Look, I think there may already be some in other parts of the world. That's the future, I think.
Yeah. Okay, the next question, before we began this discussion, I actually said to Lori that if nobody asked this question, I was going to ask it, but somebody did ask the question, and here it is. Please comment on the likelihood of these laws being reversed if the GOP, and the GOP will get into power next time or sometime. So what's to stop everything switching back as quickly as we pass the laws?
It's a very fair and good question. They've made themselves vulnerable for that very thing. But let me tell you, we have not had a Republican trifecta in Minnesota since 1969. So switching back, let's think about this. In 2024, that's the middle of Tim Walz's term. And it's the middle of the state Senate term. And so the only thing that could change in 2024 is the Minnesota House, which isn't as closely tied as the Senate is. And it's also a presidential year. And in presidential years, we have high voter turnout. And in Minnesota, high voter turnout has tended to favor Democrats. Doesn't mean it always will, but that has tended to be the pattern. So I think part of the reason that there was such a giddy up, let's do things attitude among DFLers this year is they had a sort of a sense of political security from that situation I just described. They don't think they are as vulnerable in 2024 as perhaps they thought they were back in 2013, 2014, when they had a trifecta, but they kind of held off on some things. There wasn't, back in 2013, 2014, I kept hearing them talk about, we have to avoid overreach. Didn't hear that very much this year. So, but yeah, there is not much Republican interest in a lot of these ideas. And it speaks to the big divide that we have developed in our nation and in our state over a lot of these policies. There be more Republican buy-in on things like early childhood that I'm writing about, and there seems to be
that leads directly to our next question, which is, did any Republicans vote for more money for police? Was it possible to vote for more money for police and not vote for the rest of the legislation that are surrounded those issues of incarceration and so on?
I would have to go back and look at the vote totals on that public safety bill and see exactly what they were. And so I'm not able to answer that with great specificity, but I don't think there were Republican votes for any of those big bills. And then the bills were indeed packaged in such a way that the money and the policy were together. That speaks to that single subject rule mention I made earlier, and how I think the legislature is vulnerable at some point to a brave Supreme Court that says you have to stop packaging bills like in this fashion. But there was a very conscious Republican choice not to vote for these bills so that they could campaign against them. And so they could say that this is all extreme and it's all a radical DFL agenda. Even things that I think in a different climate, many folks might have supported. This is why Jim Abler gets a story today in Post or whatever publication I was reading just before we began, because he stood out as an exception.
Uh-huh. In general, would you comment a bit about, there was much more political unity among the Republicans, more party discipline, I guess you'd say. Is that a good thing? Because in that it reflects the increasing polarization of, Minnesota political sides.
Yeah, no, there was more party discipline than I have seen before on both sides. And
Mm-hmm.
it does indeed reflect increasing polarization. And in terms of our ability to have consensus government,
Yeah.
bipartisan government, it's in not very good shape. It's in tatters. And
Mm-hmm.
what I have been observing through years of covering divided government, and we had so
Yeah.
much divided government from 1990 until this year. The only period where we had government that was not divided was 2013 and 2014. The rest of the time, we had the House and Senate split, or we had a governor who was, in one case, for 4 years, we had a governor who was neither Republican nor Democrat. So we had divided government, and you we being Minnesotans and practical people and needing state government as much as we do, relying on state government as much as we do, you'd think we would have gotten good at it, been able to figure out how to make it work, and the opposite was the case. It got to governing became more and more and more difficult, to the point that one of the reasons we had such a big surplus this year is that the session in 2022 ended with a nothing burger, ended with lots of money left on the table and not much spending or decision making at all. They just more or less walked away from their obligations that year. And I think to some extent you can argue that the 2022 election then that produced a DFL majority in both houses was in part a reaction to this gridlock that got absolutely nothing done. That's a continuing concern, and we are certainly there's nothing about this session that would alleviate that concern. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. I'm not a native of Minnesota, but I've lived here for about 35 years. And I remember when I moved here in the 80s, there was an extraordinary, for me coming from California, a feeling of comedy, of sort of working across the lines. That seems to be disappearing. Why do you think that is?
It's Minnesota catching up with the national trend. I think, for a long time we had a nonpartisan legislature.
Right.
Caucused as liberals or conservatives, but they ran in a nonpartisan way. That meant, among other things, that every legislative district had a contest, and that politics were a little closer to home in that respect. But we also had built. This is my Minnesota political history hat now on. We built in the middle of the 20th century a DFL party that was center left, with Hubert Humphrey working hard to keep the far left out, and a center right party. And this is the book I wrote with Dave Dernberger, When Republicans Were Progressive. A party that was built by Harold Stassen, and that was very much interested in making government right-sized, but making it work well at the appropriate levels. And those ideas were not so far apart. And that plus our remote geography, at that time remote from the rest of the country, gave us a little bit of a sense that we're kind of on our own here. We can figure this out for ourselves. We can invent our own way. We were willing to stand apart from the rest of the national trends. A lot of that sentiment is gone now. We are very much part of the national stream, political stream. And we see that now reflected in a Republican Party that is quite a ways to the right, and a DFL party that's got a socialist wing now on the left.
Yeah. Can you provide more detail about making it easier to expunge nonviolent criminal records? How will this work? Will it apply to DWIs? Says this question.
Yeah, I have not delved into that enough to be able to answer that question. I'm sorry. I have just read it in accounts of that bill, that's one of the things that has happened. I can tell you that one of the ways this happens, though, is with regard to marijuana-related charges. As we have legalized marijuana now, there's a provision in that bill that if you have a marijuana offense on a criminal record, that can be easily expunged without having to. I think you could expunge it in the past by paying several $100s and going through a lot of rigmarole. I think the process is going to be much simpler online, and that takes care of it.
I'm going to say, although we still have quite a bit of time, we also have many, many questions. And I'm going to apologize to the audience. I'm going to try to give everyone at least one chance to ask a question. So if you've put multiple questions in the Q&A line, I'll try to get to them as I can, but I really want to give everybody at least one chance. So, okay, does red flag legislation make provision for doctors and mental health professionals to trigger? Can the red flag trigger be raised by a mental health professional, in other words?
There again, I have not covered that issue with enough depth to be able to answer a question that is that specific. I think possibly yes, but don't take my word for it. This is an idea, this red flag legislation that has been around for a while. I remember writing about it before I retired, and it's been tried in other states with some success. But people who are truly interested in reducing gun violence in the society see it as a minor step. Sad to say, it took a long time. It took us a lot of effort to get there, but it's seen as a minor thing to reduce some of this violence that we have been so plagued with.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to read this a bit out of order because, this raises a good point. With the huge positive impact that immigrants have had in the past on our society, did the legislature address any immigrant issues other than general funding for social programs?
Well, I think there are a couple of big ones. One is and I should have had this on my recitation of big things that were done. We've been trying since I think at least 2007 to allow undocumented immigrants to have driver's licenses. And that finally happened. Again, this is part of that pent-up agenda. This is something that law enforcement in the state has wanted for a long time. It makes people, if they're documented or licensed to drive in the usual way, it just makes them more responsible drivers and makes them more accountable drivers. So that happened. And there's also, I think, a provision to allow undocumented immigrants access to some health programs that they were previously denied. So in those two ways, and we have, as a state, I think we are still more friendly to immigration than many other states. The Minnesota Chamber of Commerce has been really a good and strong, outspoken group pointing out over and over again the value of immigrants to our workforce, how the state would benefit if the federal government would regularize our whole immigrant procedures. The problems that we are having at our southern border are real and ought not be minimized, but this is a federal obligation. And Minnesota, I think, with its long history of refugee settlement and its long history, at the turn of the 20th century, 1 out of every 3 Minnesotans was born in another country. And that maybe includes some of the ancestors of the people who are participating today in this program.
Quite possibly.
So we have a close personal connection to immigration in this state, and we see its value in building a society that is robust and that has a spirit of a can-do spirit that comes from those experiences of challenge and assertion that go with resettlement.
I don't mean to sound overly cynical, but is it possible that part of our support, our strong record on issues of immigration, is related to our distance from the southern border?
Well, I think that's certainly possible. But I'd like to say it's also possible because a lot of us know our own family stories.
Okay. All right. You've seen the percentage of women elected in Minnesota increase over the years. What's your impression of the current class of women legislators? And are they collaborating across party lines more than we see on the national level?
Oh, I'm proud of these women leaders. I really am. I think that we're seeing some real strength there. And I'm also seeing some internal collaboration of these women within their caucuses that is admirable. I think without getting myself in too much trouble, speak about the good relationship that developed this year between people who would have been distant rivals, I fear, in other situation. State Senator Erin Murphy, my state senator here in St. Paul, was a candidate for governor, in 2018 and is now a state senator and was the head of the Senate's campaign committee that should have, I thought, would have put her in position to be the new Senate leader. But no, that job went to Carrie Dietzig. And yet I think those two strong women worked very well together and made it a productive session. And there was no reporting of a continued rift in that caucus between them. And I think that's to both of their credit. Now, you asked, though, about bipartisanship across the aisles when it comes to women legislators. I think we're harder pressed to find that again. It speaks to what we were talking about a moment ago, about how difficult bipartisan action has become, even in a state where we had divided government for so long, and the need to have you needed to have bipartisanship in order to pass a budget. But what did we do? We shut down government several times. We had botched ends of sessions. We many years couldn't pass even a bonding bill, which is sort of the candy jar at the end of the session where you get to take a project home. It was not a good show.
The next question I don't totally understand, so perhaps you could explain the question as well as answer it. Does the 100% renewable energy requirement have some kind of fail-safe for coming blackouts? Can Excel change it back quickly? I'm not quite sure I understand, and perhaps others in the audience don't understand, but I bet you do. So.
Well, is there sort of an exit ramp or an off ramp for a utility that is finding itself unable to meet this standard?
Oh, I see. Sure.
And the answer is yes. The Public Utilities Commission is going to be playing an important role here in making sure that utilities in Minnesota are on track to meet the standard, and there are benchmarks at various years that they have to hit. And if they can't, and have a good case to make to the PUC why they can't, there is an opportunity they don't have to change the law. There's an opportunity within this statute to get some relief, and certainly there's. The legislature meets every year. There's also the potential to go back to the legislature and get relief in that fashion as well. But yeah, there is an allowance for that. The Republican Party tried to call this the blackout bill. And it occurred to me that if the utilities thought that was the case, they would have been right there saying that too, but they didn't. And so, in fact, the utilities were mostly, at least tacitly, supportive of this. And so it makes me wonder if this is doable, or the planet needs it. Let's get going, and let's not demonize each other for trying to do this.
On the subject of the energy provisions, could you talk more about how the energy incentives, the tax incentives passed, will affect the individual? Credits for solar panels and electric vehicles and so on.
Well, I can tell you that when we bought our electric car last year, we got a federal tax credit of $7,500 on our federal.
And there has been a question that I haven't read yet. The audience wants to know, what EV did you buy?
Okay, we bought a Volkswagen ID4, and we like it very much. Okay,
well, now you know.
Okay, and we got a federal credit for that. And if the state's law then in 2022 had been what it is now in 2023, in addition, on our state taxes, we would have received an additional $2,500 credit. So the total buy down from state and fed is $10,000, which is not peanuts. And especially Volkswagen is not as expensive a car as a Tesla. So this begins to do what we need to do, which is to move the price of these vehicles, which are cheaper to operate than internal combustion cars. But the price of these vehicles is high, and we need to move that price point closer to what middle-class people can tolerate.
Sure.
The state is putting its thumb on that scale to the tune of another $2,500 for an EV. That's maybe enough for some people to take a second look at this option. But it can't just be what works for me financially. That's certainly part of what you have to think about in any kind of a major purchase. But we also have to think about what is our obligation to this planet that is our home, and our ability for this planet to sustain human life. This is getting to a serious point, and I don't know if Americans have fully come to grip with what a serious point we're at here. This is something we have to really, as Americans, step up for, because we are still the world's leader, and this is a role we can't shirk.
Okay. Do you think, says this questioner, Minnesota will be joining the National Popular Vote Compact? And for those of us who aren't quite sure, could you define what is the National Popular Vote Compact?
Well, yeah, we did. I should have put that on.
We've already done that.
We did. This is one of the things that was in that bill. And so you know what that is. That's a bunch of states have agreed with each other through a state by state compact or state agreements that if that their electors will be cast for the winner of the popular vote, and this agreement will go into effect when enough states have accepted it to equal at least 270 electoral college votes, or in other words, a majority in electoral college. We're not there yet. We're only at 210 or something like that. But this is a step, and it's a controversial step. My ex-colleague, Doug Tice at the Star Tribune, is one who's very much against this and has written a column against it. And there's another, Doug is a Republican-leaning fellow, and there's another Republican-leaning fellow who has been from Minnesota, who's been a national speaker on this, who's in favor of it. And his name is Stuart Rosenstein, I think his name is. Anyway, so this is something that people of different perspectives can disagree on. And I'm myself a bit on the fence on it, quite frankly, because while I'm not a fan of the Electoral College, I think it's in many ways anti-democratic. On the other hand, a straightforward amendment of the Electoral College, a constitutional amendment would suit me, I think. To do a change via national electoral vote compact will make it so that some states will say to their electors, even though in our state you voted for candidate X, you're going to go to Washington and cast your vote for candidate Y. That doesn't feel good to me. And it also, there's a variety of other arguments that are made, some of which are decent arguments and some of which are not, concerning how it will change campaigning. In fact, I'm not a fan of how we campaign now. We now focus too much on certain swing states and not enough on the country as a whole. I think that there is, the 14th Amendment, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment was, after the Civil War, remade our Constitution in many respects. And that 14th Amendment is just a marvel. We still have, as an overlay in our Constitution, we still have some structures that were created in the 18th century that were created with slave states in mind. And part of, I think, our obligation as citizens and stewards of this country in the 21st century is to take another look at some of that stuff. And that Electoral College would be on the list for me.
Okay. All right. Here's another question about the urban-rural divide. What is the DFL doing to address the urban-rural divide? But I'm going to broaden that and just ask, what are the roots of the urban-rural divide? Is it indigenous to Minnesota, or is it imported from the national dispute?
We've always had a rural-urban divide in Minnesota, but it got so much worse about 10 years ago, when I think it became, well, you remember in 2012, we had on the ballot a question regarding same-sex marriage, and it was well noticed in lots of places that there were places in urban Minnesota where that same-sex marriage banning amendment got 80%, 90%, no votes. And there were places in greater Minnesota that got 85, 70%, 80% yes votes. Yes. And so the split was very obvious for anyone to see. And then the very next session, 2023, we did legalize at the state level same-sex marriage. And I think light bulbs went on in political operatives' minds. Here's an issue that we can make some hay on. And we know from all kinds of political science research that emotional issues that pertain to identity, drive votes more than economic issues do.
Really?
So is the DFL trying to do something about this, trying to get back rural votes? I would say yes. And I would say the way that our state funding formulas work, which they just bolstered, sending money from the metro area to greater Minnesota for schools and public safety. That the Minnesota Miracle is really a great engine of moving money to greater Minnesota. And it's not been understood or sold that way, but that's really what happens. And so there's a strong economic case to be made that when we support local government aid and county program aid and school aid formula, to the extent that they're serving greater Minnesota, but economics aren't what's driving the argument. What was working, I noticed in the 2016 period in elections in Minnesota, was to argue that the DFL was too metrocentric. What does that mean? Well, it had something to do with same-sex marriage and lifestyle and opposition to guns and other kinds of social issues that began to be about identity more than about economics. There's a wonderful article in the New York Times just today about how, as human beings, the way our brains work make us susceptible to arguments that the good old days were better and we ought not advance forward, that we're in worse shape now, morally and other respects. There's some of that in this rural-urban divide as well, that we need to cling to an old culture and not change and adapt, even as we have through our technology, faster change than we've ever seen before. So.
Excuse me, just sorry, there's too much going on in out in the real world here. All right, let's go right on. What is your opinion of how Minnesota Republicans differ in general from the national party? Are they more inclined to support Democratic-initiated bills that would benefit their constituents, despite the national party line of blocking anything that the Democrats propose? It sounds like your answer would be no, but maybe it's even worse on the national level. I don't know.
Well, I'm trying to think, what Republican would I point to be an illustration of that willingness to stand apart from the national party? Maybe there's something that Pete Stauber has supported in the 8th district that would qualify, but nothing is leaping quickly to mind. No, if anything, as the Minnesota Republican Party switched from the party that Dave Dernberger and I wrote about in our book, this center-right, more or less progressive party, to its modern iteration, the issue that drove that the most was the abortion issue. And it's notable that one of our members of Congress is the wife of the head of the Minnesota Citizens Concern for Life and the daughter of the founder of the Minnesota Citizens Concern for Life. We have the Minnesota abortion issue embodied in Michelle Fischbach in a way that I can't imagine any other state being quite so, having the Republican Party be quite so lockstep with the abortion issue as she represents for this party. That issue is still very much with the states. We just had legislation at this session. We'll probably have something on the ballot in 2024 concerning an equal rights amendment, and its implications for the abortion issue will be the big talking point. And the Supreme Court has more or less said states have added on this. Well, here we are. So I don't know that we have a situation right now in Minnesota where Republicans are like they were in the book that Dave and I wrote, which, by the way, that book's narrative ends in about 1994. So 30 years.
Yeah. What role, if any, this increasing polarization, it represents fundamental differences between urban and rural Minnesotans, but what degree, if any, has it been inflated or exacerbated by the presence of the former President Trump in our national life?
I'd like to think that the former president is more of a symptom than an instigator, but he's certainly not been a helpful force here. No, what we have begun to identify more with our national tribe, it seems like, rather than identify as Minnesotan. And we've been encouraged to think that way by our political leaders who, in my view, ought to know better, because they should have seen the value of Minnesota aggregating its resources, doing things the way we've designed to do them, so that we can lift up the whole. That's what the Minnesota Miracle of 50 years ago that we've been hearing more about lately. That's what that was all about, that we could aggregate our resources at the state level, use the big money tax collecting engine of the state government, tax the metro area at a high level, and then distribute those resources in such a way that we have a high quality of life. And it's Minnesotans have renewed that impulse again and again. I'm thinking right now about the sales tax constitutional amendment that was on the ballot in 2008, dedicating a portion of the sales tax to the arts and culture and natural resources. That was remarkable, and we passed that at a time of great economic distress in the country. But we've shown a willingness to come together and do things that we want to do together, and this nationalization of our politics, exacerbated by social media and by the way we fund and operate campaigns, that has made matters worse. It's maybe successful in the short term. I would submit it's destructive to Minnesota. There's something important about Minnesota in the long run, and I would like for us to find a way to get back to thinking about ourselves as embarked together on this kind of unique experiment to produce a state with an extraordinary high quality of life.
Yeah, and I would like to point out that 2008 legacy amendment that you refer to, that is the funding source that makes this series possible. So I always acknowledge it in the opening remarks when appropriate. So, all right. Has there ever been a Republican trifecta? I think you said there was.
No.
Could you talk more about that?
Well, the state had a Republican state Senate from the dawn of statehood, you might say, until 1972 election. So anytime we had a Republican governor and a Republican House, we had a Republican trifecta in those years. And the last time we had a Republican trifecta was 1969. And I would say 70, but the legislature didn't meet in 70 because that was still the years when they only met in biennial sessions.
Yes.
A lot of changes in the legislature happened in the 1970s. Party designation was one, annual sessions was another, and I could tell you a whole list of things that happened then to build the modern legislature. But yeah, the Republicans, when you think about what's sort of the set point in Minnesota politics in the 1900s, in the 20th century, it's moderate republicanism. That was the dominant government that we had at the state level for a long, long time.
Even though Minnesota was known nationally for Democratic leaders from this state, like Mondale and Humphrey, and yet the tone was Republican in the...
Well, you remember Humphrey puts the DFL party together in 1944 and is elected mayor of Minneapolis the next year, and then is elected to the U.S. Senate in 1948 and makes a big name for himself as this champion of civil rights. And by the way, there's a new book coming out that's just dynamite about that whole period.
Yes.
And that's a sort of a pivotal moment that it begins a change in Minnesota's politics. And I don't think a lot of Minnesotans realize what came before that. But what came before that was a lot of years of very Republican dominance of the state. And then we've had since then, I think, a lot of years of shared control. We've supported Democrats at the presidential level, with the only exception being Nixon in 1972. Otherwise, we've supported Democrats for president consistently since 1960. But before that, we supported Eisenhower. And I don't remember if Truman carried this state in 48. He may have. I kind of don't think so. But FDR was popular in this state, but so were all the Republicans before him. So
okay, all right. Let's see. Okay, here we go. What about the marijuana passage? What's the timeline on that? And will there be a test for marijuana impaired drivers? This person is really obviously thinking ahead here.
Yeah, and I'm not going to be able to do chapter and verse real well on this because, again, it's not an issue I wrote about, and I don't get real deep in stuff unless I write about them now that I'm retired.
Sure.
But I know that there's a slow phase out, and that we or phase in, I should say, of this law, and we the first phase I think starts actually this summer when people are allowed to grow a certain number of marijuana plants in their house. penalty. I think that the sale of marijuana is not likely until sometime in the second half of 2024. Probably in time.
Okay.
and,
Right.
and I believe there is a real difficulty in terms of that other states have experienced as well as regarding tests for impaired driving. And it's a concern. And I'm hoping to hear more about that.
Okay. All right. I have read, says this viewer, that early education actually has no long-term benefit. I'm not sure why Rolnick ignores studies that found this. Even Head Start studies show had no permanent benefit. Could you comment on that?
Just yesterday, I talked to Art, and he just yesterday sent me 3 emails with all kinds of studies telling me just the opposite.
Oh, okay.
And not only his studies say, he was telling me not only there's a big difference in the rather near term in the academic performance of young children who have quality early ed, but it makes a difference in how they raise their kids in the next generation. There are studies that go back, the Michigan studies that go back 40 years now, and you see dramatic benefits. This is really well documented, and people who tell you otherwise are not telling you the straight story. Sorry, this is really well documented.
Okay. All right. I'm going to say this because it reflects, I think, the tone of some of the questions that I'm not going to maybe be able to get to. It seems to me, it seems to many in the audience, that you are supportive of, that you approve of most of the legislation passed by this session. Does that mean that the far-right Republicans are correct when they say that the mainstream media is all a bunch of liberals?
I'm retired. I'm not working for the mainstream media anymore.
No, but your
I do write an occasional
changed.
column as a freelancer.
But your politics haven't changed that much,
yes.
I assume.
I'm able to speak as an individual, and that's here. Yeah, I'm not speaking for the Star Tribune, and I should make that clear. The Star Tribune and I had a long relationship, but we did retire in 2018. Let me tell you that a lot of what happened this year are things that I wrote editorials in support of before I retired. That's because so much of what passed this year has a long pedigree, has been worked on for many years. So yeah, since I wrote editorials in support of it, I supported it. But yes, that it is not the case that I speak in any way for the Star Tribune.
No, and I don't think that was the implication. It was more the question of, is it true that most journalists for mainstream media do tend to approve of the liberal agenda?
I can only speak for myself at this point. I'm sorry.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Sorry, I'm just looking for first-time questions here. Okay. Why did the ERA amendment to the Minnesota Constitution not pass?
Yeah, I was surprised at that too. Quite frankly, I was actually thinking I would be writing something about that before too long, and it's been held over till next year. The House Speaker said that she was surprised when the Senate passed it on the last day or two of session and sent it to the House. They weren't expecting that would happen this year, and they weren't quite ready. And I think that's an issue that they should have been ready for, because it's only been around for at least 50 years. In fact, probably was first introduced in the Minnesota legislature in 1922 by the first women elected to, or 1923 session, it would have been 100 years ago. So we're only 100 years late on this. I suspect this will happen in 2024. And I suspect that the issue that held it up was any wording that might be interpreted as pertinent to abortion. And there's probably a split in the majority caucus of how explicit about abortion this language should be. And I don't know that that's been resolved. And until it is, it might stay stuck.
Would the passage of the ERA have any practical effect at this point? I thought there was a statute of limitations, essentially, that because the ERA didn't pass in the 70s, that missed the window of opportunity. Or is that not the case?
No, well, there's two issues here. There's a federal ERA and a state one. And the federal ERA, the Congress put a 1982 deadline on it. And they did so, and it's never been really adjudicated by the court whether they had the authority to do so. And as of a couple of years ago, 38 states, the requisite number of states, have ratified the ERA that was sent to the states in 1972. The question that is before a court somewhere, someplace in the federal judicial system is, does that 1982 cutoff date still apply? Was that constitutional?
I see, yeah.
And so that's one issue. But the issue that is unresolved at the Minnesota legislature is, should the Minnesota Constitution be amended in such a way that there is an explicit guarantee of protection for women's legal rights in the Minnesota Constitution? And that's when I spoke just now about the wording of such an amendment, it is at that state level that we care about, that there's still perhaps a dispute a bit about how that wording is phrased when it pertains to health and reproductive rights. I think that's still what is the hang up. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Do you think moving to ranked choice voting, I know that there's going to be study on this issue. Do you think that moving to that ranked choice voting would help resolve the constant back and forth of passing or repeal of laws, based on who's in charge of the legislature at any given time? How would that work on the state level? Let's maybe broaden the question to.
Well, ranked choice voting is of interest when we have a multi-party system, more than a two-party system. And Minnesota's been prone to that, but not always. It doesn't much matter, I think, if you have just two parties. The first round of an election produces a winner and a loser. But if you have multiple parties and you're trying to use ranked choice voting so that the people who voted for the candidate that had the least votes, their ballots are examined for a second choice. Those second choices are reallocated until some candidate achieves 50% plus one and is a true majority winner at that point. That, I think, that exercise is a coalition building exercise. Alliances get formed between candidates who are likely to win and candidates lower down on the ballot whose supporters may have some overlap in issues. Yes. That's always been sort of the promise of ranked choice voting, that it gets us to majority rule. And we've had, in my opinion, too much minority rule in both Minnesota and in our nation. So I'm interested in those things which would increase the likelihood of majority rule. And that's why I've been a fan of ranked choice voting. It's not a panacea. It doesn't solve all of our problems, but it would I think, by the way, it would encourage third-party candidacies, encourage the dynamism that comes with that. It might produce a livelier politics in Minnesota, and a politics that better reflects the true sentiment of a majority of people.
Would ranked choice voting address the problem but the issue that arises now with primary participation? Generally, voters in primaries tend to be on the extremes of their parties. And so candidates come to the fore based on the most oppositional of the two parties. Would ranked choice voting address that?
If ranked choice voting were used in such a way that primaries were eliminated, yes, because then you would presumably have one election that would be high turnout. The problem with primaries is often that they are low turnout, and that the people who do turn out tend to be the zealots of one sort or another. If you have only one election and it's a high turnout election, you, I think, have a better chance of having its result reflect the sentiment of the majority. But there are other ways to administer ranked choice voting, and one would be to use it at the primary level. And that's among the ideas that this task force that will be appointed soon will look at. A way to think about that is think about the 2016 Republican presidential contest, when you had something like 17 candidates in a row, and one of them was Donald Trump, who would win often those primaries with maybe 30% of the vote. He didn't have a majority, but he won in a winner-take-all system, and was, by May of that year, the nominee. In a ranked choice voting situation, he might have not been the winner of some of those primaries. He might have had his 30% and no more, and some other, through a shuffling of the ballots, somebody else might have emerged. Somebody like Marco Rubio, who knows, would have been a maybe different result.
Yeah. I normally don't identify the people who are asking the questions, but I see I'm going to read a question here from a very popular and longtime speaker in our series, Todd Lefko. Hi, Todd.
Hi, Todd.
I think a good fraction of the audience knows Todd by this point. His question is, what is the long-term impact of the DFL becoming the urban party and the GOP becoming the rural party in Minnesota?
Well, Todd, it's a tough question, isn't it? Because I don't like it. Yeah, the long in the shortish term, it looks as though the metro area is continuing to grow, and the greater Minnesota area is continuing to lose population. Now, things could change in that respect, but if that population trend continues and we continue to have this strong rural-urban split, you can envision a situation where greater Minnesota doesn't do so well at the legislature, where we change our funding formulas such that Metro Minnesota gets more resources and greater Minnesota does not. And in fact, you can argue that that happened already this session. We still are funding the old Minnesota Miracle programs. Local government aid got an increase, county program aid got an increase. But instead of funding transit in a statewide way, we're going to fund transit with a metro-only sales tax. And housing also has a small component of sales tax, 0.25%, metro only. That money will be used in the metro area for housing. But greater Minnesota has a housing issue too. Greater Minnesota is more averse to taxes. And you see then this starting to go like this. And I as someone who grew up in South Dakota and has a great fondness for the places in between Sioux Falls and here, I would sure hate to see us give up on the quality of trying to boost the quality of life in the whole state. We all benefit, I would argue. So, Todd, you asked a good question. We have a dynamic political system in Minnesota. We've all seen in our lifetimes how dynamic this can be. So I guess I don't think current trends will always prevail, but I think we do better in Minnesota when we aggregate our resources and come together as one state. And it would be well if we had leadership that talked that way. I liked that Tim Walz used One Minnesota as his theme. I hope we see more evidence that that's really what he's trying to bring about here.
Okay. Can you speak to the quality of the bonding bill?
I did not go into the depth of the bonding bill that I might have in other years because I'm retired. I was actually pleasantly surprised that they got one done. Bonding has become one of those areas that instead of being a routine part of government that we fund infrastructure, it's become sort of a fighting ground and kind of optional. There have been way too many years in the last 15 or 20 when we've done no bonding bill, and that is a bad thing for, again, a state that is so dependent on state government. Lots of our colleges and universities and our smaller communities really need state support in order to have the kind of infrastructure that makes for a good modern life. So glad to see that bonding bill. Glad to see that we're not trying to keep it under $1 billion. $1 billion was the size of the bonding bill that Arnie Carlson passed in 1988. I'm saying this wrong, 1998. 25 years ago, and it was time to finally crack that $1 billion threshold. So I was glad to see that. I suspect if I got into that bonding bill, there would be things I would not like, because we always used to say bonding state money has to be for projects with regional significance at a minimum. Statewide significance, even better, but for sure, regional significance. Do all of those projects meet that test? I'm not sure. And I think the University of Minnesota, again, wasn't treated as well as the Minnesota state system. And that, I think, going forward is a problem for us. So those would be two concerns I would have as I would get into that look. The other thing that's notable about the bonding bill this year is that part of the deal that brought it forward was, I think, $300 million additional for nursing homes. And that's a greater Minnesota measure. That's a One Minnesota measure. In many of those small towns, the nursing home is one of the biggest employers, and it's a real community center. And to keep those nursing homes able to hire good people, to keep their staff and keep them compensated at a reasonable level, that's important.
Okay, unfortunately, we are almost out of time, but I do want to bring up, we had someone in the audience who either knew this or went and looked it up. I'm very impressed. Wikipedia shows Truman won Minnesota in 1948 with 57.16% of the state vote.
Wow,
And
better than I would have expected. Wow.
okay.
Right.
And I'm sorry, we are just about out of time. We've set some sort of record. We still have 40 questions. That's 40 questions in the Q&A line. I feel like we should invite our speaker back just to answer questions, just to answer all the unasked questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to more of them. They were all interesting. I wish we'd been able to. Thank you so much to our speaker, Laurie Sturdevant. Thank you to Grayson and Carmi behind the scenes. Thank you so much to the audience who never lets me down. I always tell our speakers, you're going to get some really great questions, and they always do. So thank you so much. Please, everyone, come back for the final talk in our series for this session. Next week, this will be, again, a very appropriate talk because we expect the Supreme Court decisions to come down this week. Hopefully they'll come down before Tuesday, because that's when we'll have Professor Timothy Johnson from the University of Minnesota on the topic, A Look at the Supreme Court Term 2022-2023. So please, everyone, come back for that talk. But for today, I'm going to say thank you and goodbye.